A reminder for all those who are seeking CLE credits, be sure you see Karen Ludlow at the end with your attendance verification. Please find wherever your signature is, add your email, because this will all become through email, your booklets. In addition, there'll be the information which you saw earlier today through Neil and Matt, as well as additional information that has been provided through associates of Phillips Lytle, Trichet, and Gabrielle on the whole RICO questions. And then we have additional information that's been provided by Tony Bruce and Lee Coppola. So the book, that itself is priceless. But the way to get it is, we're going to get this via email. The fall of the Buffalo Mob was inspired today by Lee Coppola. Lee was here a year or so ago and looking for a free dinner, said, you know, let's do another one, and I'd like to do that. And so what we learned about Lee Coppola at that time was that, of course, St. Bonaventure, Dean of Journalism for many, many years. One of his students was Michael Hill from Chautauqua Institution. Also in that subsequent classes was our new president, Kristen McMahon. And he's got a long, long resume, and you'll see that in the book when you provide the email. He was elected to the Buffalo Broadcasters Hall of Fame. And just a brief notes, because I will not get into any detail on any of our speakers here today, because that'll all flow during the course of the conversation. But it says Coppola had a most varied career. That's an understatement. Newspaper reporter, a TV investigative reporter. He was the Mike Wallace of our area, so you know you're going to have a bad day when Lee Coppola knocks on your door. He was an assistant U.S. attorney before becoming dean at St. Bonaventure. He graduated from St. Bonaventure in 1964, and following 2.5 years of military service, he was hired by the Buffalo News. His article in 1967, his articles on organized crime and the witness protection program were the inspiration, along with one of our other guests, the 1980 movie Hide in Plain Sight, starring James Caan. It just goes on. So that's a little bit about Lee Coppola, who is the inspiration for today. Further inspirations for today is when Judge Salvatore Martoche, who's been here a couple of times, one on General Donovan and one on with the Appellate Division 4th Department, we talked about this movie called Hide in Plain Sight. Judge Martoche, a lawyer, retired New York State Supreme Court Appellate Division judge, born in Buffalo, Bachelor of Science from Canisius College in 1962, his JD from University of North Dakota School of Law in 1967. He was a public defender office, and then went into private practice from 1969 to 1982, and it's during that time period of which we'll be talking about today. Assistant counsel to the majority of the New York State Senate from 74 to 82, administrator for the Erie County Bar Association Pretrial Services Agency from 72 to 81. Hide in Plain Sight, which we'll see in just a second. 1980 movie starring James Caan is based on one of Judge Martoche's cases. And he's credited with reforms in the United States Federal Witness Protection Program. He was also a U.S. attorney for the Western District of New York from 1982 to 1986. And a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, and a poet on everything else. Did just about everything. Our third guest comes incredibly highly recommended by the FBI. We have some FBI people here, Tony. Leanne is here checking out everybody. She's Skyping that into Brent Isaacson as we speak. So you are being watched. That's something you probably never knew. For 37 years, Tony Bruce worked as the Assistant United States Attorney in the United States Attorney's Office in Western District. During that time, he was the organized crime He was involved in the Organized Crime and National Security Division of the office, served as senior litigation counsel, retiring in 2006. He was part of the strike force, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Nobody has a more in-depth workings of the prosecution, especially of organized crime, than Tony Bruce. He's currently of counsel for Andriozzi and Bluestein. Boy, I tell you, got that wrong. And also an adjunct professor at SUNY Buffalo School of Law. He got his JD at West Virginia University College of Law, 1974, and his BS from West Virginia. I think it's West by God and Smile when you say it, Virginia, as I recall. So I am really looking forward to this. You have no idea. Because I suspect that once I just start the engine, it'll run all by itself. So we're going to show, to put everything into a little bit of perspective, and this may be a little hard for you to maybe turn around and see. We're going to show a 4-minute clip of a movie starring James Caan, which will set the scene for the rest of the tape.
Yeah, well, anyway, this bullshit guy, he says you have many accidents here, right? So Moriarty's here, he tells them very rarely, you know? I mean, everybody's got knives to cut the rubber. Maybe somebody cuts their wrist, you know, cuts their arm. Nothing you can call major, right? So...
She always tells me last minute, you know? I mean, she's going out with the CLE, so Ruthie says either you sit with them or they stay alone. Either way, it don't matter to her. It's nice, huh?
Terrific girl.
Okay. You don't tell nobody that. I mean, I just say that to you. That's,
what are
that's
you
only
kidding?
for you and me, all right? Anyway, what? I see him once a week, so it's a pleasure for me.
Excuse me, Don Angelo Vanucci. I would like for you to meet my lady. Ruthie, this is Don Angelo Vanucci.
How do you do?
It's a pleasure. Bobby Momisi.
How do you do? Pleasure.
Oh, Pete Fiacco.
My pleasure.
And, sorry, I'm
Frankie Irish.
How do you do?
Frankie Irish.
Nice to meet you, ma'am.
I just want to say it's a beautiful party, you know? I want to thank you for inviting me.
We can say to you that if you will open up with us, give us everything that you have concerning the Vanucci family, and if the details of your testimony can be corroborated...
What's all this F shit? You do me a favor, huh? Don't do me no favors.
That's enough. Jackie, what do you think we're doing here? Telling cute stories?
I don't need no favors.
The hell you don't!
If we can get enough hard
Bill,
evidence...
so become a fake. What's in it for me, huh? What do I get out of it?
We put you in the witness relocation program.
The witness, what? What the hell's that?
After we clear you with the state, we take you and your family, we give you new identities, we move you to another city and get you a job, and no one will ever be able to find you.
When you go up against the government, Mr. Haglund, things can get tough. I'm not talking about weeks. Could drag on for months, years. Involve research, very heavy legal expense. I'll call you in a day or so. Okay?
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Evelyn. Evelyn. Evelyn!
Yes, sir.
Call the evening news. See if Lee McHugh is around. I want you to write about this guy.
Human interest thing, is that what you're saying?
Last week, your paper runs a full page on a blind vegetarian that ran a Boston Marathon, for Christ's sake. What I'm talking about is a man whose children were stolen. Human interest, my ass.
Okay. Thank you, Henry.
I'm gonna take him on. The whole goddamn government.
The whole goddamn government.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. The lower court decision fails to hold the government accountable for its intrusion into a domestic situation. It upholds the legitimacy of arbitrarily, without inquiry, removing these children from their natural father and blocking any attempt to learn of their whereabouts by creating new identities.
The children were living with their natural mother pursuant to a valid divorce decree that gave her custody. Naturally, they all lived with her new husband, Mr. Scalise. Is it unlawful? Is it even unfair to protect a man who freely testified for the public good and by so doing placed his life in jeopardy? The lower court found that it was not.
What about the danger to my kids?
I think the actual story is multi-layered, and they told it on only one layer. But the message is clear, even there, that this was a case, in my opinion, of an attempt by the government to do a good thing, to provide protection for people who would testify against mob figures. But, you know, we said a long time ago in this country that the ends do not justify the means. And here, there was an abuse of power. It wasn't intentional. And we never said, I never said, and Tom Leonard, my client, never said that he wanted to disturb the program or destroy the program. He simply wanted an opportunity for his children to be considered in this equation. And if the individual, Patty Calabrese in this case, was relocated with the parents, with the mother of these children, were they in danger? Were they in more danger by being there? And they had not been considered. It was something where this was a case of first instance, Greg. This was the first time this ever happened in history. And you know, they were talking about, in that clip, what they were going to do for Patty. Well, Patty Calabrese was the one who dictated, in my opinion, what they were going to do for him. And he did it in a meeting in Chautauqua County Jail. I'll tell you, they had put him in the Chautauqua, nobody really realized this, but he, in an effort to secrete him, to keep him away from possible harm in Buffalo, from possible influences, he was moved by Sam Gimbrone, who was a police sergeant at the time, and was the person who really was most responsible for flipping Calabrese. He moved him to the Chautauqua County Jail. So he's in the jail with Gimbrone, with a fellow by the name of Tom Keneally, who was the #2 person in the Washington Organized Crime Bureau that was really trying to find the right location to put a program in that would focus on a family. As you know, there are various organized crime families throughout the country, and they had tried this in a couple of other locations, and they were too big, too unwieldy. Buffalo was the right size, and they had players of significance here. They had a guy named Stefano Magaddino from Niagara Falls, who was the head of the Buffalo mob. And Magaddino became a very influential person in the scheme of things with organized crime for a couple of reasons. First of all, he was from the right town in Italy. He was the brother-in-law of Joe Bonanno, who was one of the big families in New York City. He wound up as the chair of the commission of the organized crime figures. The thing about organized crime that you're going to find out as you go through this is, number one, the biggest victims were usually other Italian Americans, and the mob, despite the fascination that the public has with them, it's not The Godfather. It's more like Goodfellas, if you saw that movie. It's gritty and dirty. They grind on fear and on intimidation and on total loyalty. Now, when Joe Valachi broke that code of loyalty, omerta, you never talk. The thing about organized crime for all those years was they depended on your oath that you took. It's amazing. These killers, these really not so nice guys, most of them, many of them, there were some who were really sucked into this by their families and by circumstances that they had no control over. But anyway, in an effort to sort of make a dent in this, the Department of Justice decided that they would put this strike force together, these groups. And as I said, the prototype was in Buffalo. A guy named Tom Keneally came in here, and he worked with the then U.S. Attorney John Curtin, whose name you may recall. And ultimately, there was a robbery of the City Hall in Buffalo, New York. And it was done by a guy named Pascal Calabrese and two others. We never did get the identity of the two others, but Calabrese was attempting to become a serious associate. Associate is a term that is used by law enforcement people to describe an unmade member who does certain activities on behalf of the mob. Well, he went into City Hall and with his usual bravado and BS, screwed up. There were two bags sitting in the treasurer's office. One had about $299,000 in it. The other had checks and about $16,000. Calabrese took the one with the checks and the $16,000. Now, and of course, in his bravado, he pistol whips the city treasurer before he leaves. He hits him in the face with his pistol. He goes into hiding. Now, he's doing this job not only to make money, because for him, the idea of honest work never crossed his mind. He was a despicable person, in my opinion, from the get-go. And Lee knows how much I detest this guy. I also detest organized crime, and I want you to know why. I think as an American of Italian extraction, I have seen the brutality. I've seen kids who were intimidated. I saw the results of loan sharking and gambling and narcotics in my neighborhood growing up. And I saw the victims, and they were mostly poor schleps, poor folks who couldn't defend themselves. I saw people trying to reach for a dream. It's so much like my observations later in life watching African Americans trying to climb out of a situation they were in, although their situation was made worse by slavery and the color of their skin. I think that the key to this whole process was a guy named Sam Gimbrone, who worked with Mike Amico, who later became the sheriff of Erie County, who testified in Congress. And they were committed to destroying or doing their best to destroy the organized crime scene in Buffalo. Now, Magaddino's great power came in large part from Prohibition. Another well-intentioned effort. We'll have Prohibition. And so when you're on the Canadian border and there's no Prohibition in Canada, you become a likely source of really good booze. I'm not talking about just the stuff that you make, and some people did that, of course, but I'm talking about getting first-class booze and distributing it all around the country, which is what made him very powerful and very rich. Of course, it didn't stop him from being greedy. and that was the reason for his ultimate demise when his troops found out he had hidden. He was not giving them Christmas bonuses, but he was keeping $500,000 in his attic, the attic of his son-in-law and daughter, and also in his funeral home. So this is the background for Hide in Plain Sight. Tom Leonard, my client, is married to a woman, her maiden name was Rochelle Greco. Rochelle was an attractive, smart woman, and I never could quite understand the attraction between her and Tom, because she was really in the fast lane, and he was really sort of a stay-at-home, watch TV and drink a beer kind of a guy. Very Buffalo guy, very blue collar. She was always looking for excitement and the fast life. Wanted the best of everything, best clothes, the best nightclubs. So it didn't surprise me to find out that they had difficulty once I knew the story. How I got involved, Greg, starts with a phone call from a lawyer who had been a judge then, but who had been a lawyer who represented Patty Calabrese when the mob did not act fast enough to get him a lawyer and get him the kind of insulation from potential influence by the law enforcement that ultimately he gave into. And that was Joe Mattina. Judge Mattina called me and he asked me if I could go to his office. I was just out of the public defender's office, just begun private practice. So I said, sure, what's up? He said, well, come on over. He said, I want to talk to you. I said, well, sure, when? He said, now. And I said, okay, my office was a stone's throw from the city court building in Buffalo. So I went over there, and he introduced me to Mr. and Mrs. Leonard. Tom had remarried, and they told me this incredible story that I almost had trouble believing, that because I was so naive that I couldn't believe that under any circumstances our government could abuse its power the way it did. I'm not saying these people shouldn't have been vigorously, attacked for their criminal acts. And Tony Bruce is a great example of someone who was a tremendous force in cleaning up a lot of what you're going to hear about later on in this lecture. But, as I said earlier, the ends do not justify the means. I cannot tell you how disgusted I was to hear that they just, one day, Tom, who was paying his child support while his then separated wife, they referred to her as his ex-wife, when she was relocated with Patty Calabrese, when they took them and secreted them along with Tom's children, they went in the middle of the night, and they would tell you that they were married. Well, they were not married. They ultimately got married in Erie, Pennsylvania, but it was a bigamous marriage because they did not have a divorce at the time of their marriage, Patty Calabrese and Rochelle. Later, there was a divorce. So the kids are with this guy who the government claims has to be secreted because he's in terrible danger. Well, if he's in terrible danger, aren't the people who are around him in terrible danger? They relocated them to Michigan, and they did so with the help of people who they knew. This, as I said, was a brand new sort of program. So there they are in the Chautauqua County Jail, and Patty is dictating the terms of his surrender, if you will. I will testify, but you're going to give me a new identity, a new job, you're going to set me up. Now, one of the things that there was a guy named Jerry Shur, S-H-U-R, who was a Justice Department official whose job it was to put these relocated people in situations where they could be monitored and all of that. But they were all feeling their way. This was the first one. Now, Calabrese gets relocated, and you know, he has a new name. He has a clean record, a slate that's clean. No criminal convictions, no arrests, no anything. Now, he caused a lot of trouble. He placed a lot of money on credit cards that were uncollected, and he was the first of many of the people who were relocated in the program who abused their fresh start. They would, you know, they didn't stop being crooks just because they were in a new location. In any event, Patty, when he decides to turn, he does so with his usual bravado, and Sam Giambrone deserves the major part of the credit for convincing the government to take a chance on him. He turned out to be a very good witness. Now, there's a great story here. After that job at City Hall, even though it didn't net much money, there was a meeting between Calabrese and a guy named Fred Rondaccio and Natarelli, a guy named Natarelli. And the meeting was really designed to see if they could use Calabrese, who they didn't like very much, who they thought was a wise-ass kid, but they were going to test him, and there were some jobs out in Los Angeles. So they put him in touch with the people who were running these jobs, and a guy named Steve Sino, who ultimately went to trial in the big organized crime case that Calabrese testified in, was going to sort of oversee this thing. And they went out to Los Angeles, and Sino introduced Calabrese to two people, a guy by the name of Bobby Milano, whose real name was Charlie Cacci. Now, Charlie Cacci had a friend named Louis Sorgi, S-O-R-G-I, who was the head of security at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. And the jobs, there were two jobs there that they were supposed to do. Number one, they were going to rob an heiress of about $500,000 worth of jewelry. She came in regularly, and she was supposed to be there, and they were going to rob her, and then they were going to rob the armored car that would come and take the daily receipts. So Calabrese was just amazed by this whole thing. They put him up in a nice apartment. They gave him walking around money, as they called it, and he was feeling that he was on the threshold of really starting out in a wonderful relationship with the mob bosses. Well, about this time, they find out in Buffalo that he's responsible for this robbery of the city treasurer's office in City Hall. So they call a halt to these activities. But the conspiracy to commit them will ultimately play a role in arresting in the arrest of some others. Now, this Bobby Milano, this singer by the name of Charlie Cacci, he and Sorgi were both members of an outfit with a capo in Los Angeles who is from Westfield, New York. A guy named Vincent Cacci, who grew up in Westfield. Now, I don't know if his brother was born in Westfield also, but that's where he was from. And he was a notoriously brutal sort of a boss. So brutality equated with loyalty. in this situation. Make a long story short, there was enough evidence. Bobby Milano gets arrested on another charge, and they find the pass key that Calabrese had told them about, that Louis Sorgi had given them. He was amazed that Louis Sorgi had a key that would get him into any room in the hotel. And I'm more surprised that Louis Sorgi wound up with that job because he did not come with a clean record to Los Angeles. Anyway, now we have my client trying to see his kids. And he's trying to see his kids. Patty has decided to testify, and he testifies very well. He does an excellent job, and the government winds up with significant convictions. And Randaccio and a couple of the others get 20 years, some get 10 years, but long time, significant sentences. A guy named Andy Phelan, who you may know that name, was the prosecutor in those cases and did a really wonderful job. So Tom goes into a situation when he can't see his kids. He goes to the local Buffalo police. He says, "Where are my children? You know, they took my children. You know, I want my children." And nobody will talk to him. Everybody stonewalls him. He goes to the FBI. The same thing. He goes to see the U.S. Attorney, the same thing. Nobody wants to discuss with him the situation. And finally, out of frustration, he goes to see some lawyers. Well, most lawyers looked at this and they said, this is just going to be too tough. This is going to be a case where you're going to take on the government. It's going to cost a lot of money. You don't have that kind of money, and the chances of winning are negligible. Well, this is why I went to law school. When this case came to my attention, I said, how can you not try, when something falls in your lap like this, how can you not try to be helpful? He had a right to see his children, just as any one of us who are parents have a right to be with our children. That was taken away from him by his government. Here's a guy who paid his taxes, voted, did all the things you're supposed to do, is not a criminal, and you have this other guy, Patty Calabrese, who's being treated like a king. He was sentenced, by the way, to 5 years for by Judge Nevins for his participation in that City Hall robbery, but he never served a day of that. He was relocated, and they may say that he was in Elmira. I guess I shouldn't say he never served a day. He was in Elmira for a short time, but it was not in the normal prison setting. And they put him in at an Air Force base for a while, and they gave him, as I said, new identities. Eventually, he found his way to Reno, Nevada. Reno, Nevada. Now, if you're trying to avoid organized crime, and if the threat is as serious as they say about, by the way, I learned in my personal investigation of this, that the people who wanted him to be safe after this all happened were the mob, and particularly Freddie Randaccio, who knew that he would be blamed for anything that happened to Calabrese. And Calabrese knew this, and he and his family and the children of Leonard were in and out of Buffalo to see his family and her family throughout the years. Again, it's a question of a good idea gone awry, okay? And I am happy to say that because of what we did with our efforts to change the program, to publicize the wrongs that were done in that program, it's a different program, and it became a different program. And the two antagonists, to me, in that situation, one by the name of Tom Keneally, the strike force lawyer who came in to head this thing up, and Jerry Scher, who was the relocation specialist who worked with the marshals to relocate and keep tabs on these people, have both sort of apologized to me for what happened. Keneally, when I went in, I was trying to do anything and everything I could to garner publicity and to sort of build this case in a way that embarrassed the government so that they might be more amenable to doing something to help Leonard. Nothing was working. I went and I tried to get a change of custody, and I served Keneally, who was then in private practice. He had just gone into private practice in Washington, D.C. And he wound up writing to the Bar Association and filing a complaint against me, claiming that I was unethical in serving him. And I had discussed it with Judge Roger Cook and a guy named Roger Williams, who was one of the two U.S. attorneys involved in the case. There was another guy named Dave Flero. Ultimately, Roger Williams became my first assistant when I was a U.S. attorney. But I discussed with the judge my desire to serve the person who I believed had crossed the line in his governmental representation and in his representation of the Calabrese husband and wife. So there they are in Reno, Nevada. They had left the program.
Just out of curiosity, Judge, being Martoche, and you're not Swedish, and you are causing some angst among the U.S. Attorney's Office and everybody else, was there any suspicion that perhaps you were being hired by Magaddino and company to ferret out Calabrese?
Any suspicion? There was a lot of suspicion, and it's sort of one of the things that makes me bristle, because if my name had been Peterson, there would not have been, even for a moment, that suspicion. I can honestly tell you, I never had anything to do with organized crime, except I liked the chicken wings and pizza from a certain location in Buffalo. I can tell you that it followed me around, and it delayed my appointment, I believe, as U.S. Attorney, and there was always a sort of a stigma, because I was as bad as I felt about it, my wife, who is not Italian-American, felt it for me and for our children, because there was this awful sort of odor about that. And then, you know, I was trying to interest the media, as I said, and that's where Lee comes in. He was not the first good reporter who could have broke this story. There was a good reporter who worked in what they called the hole, which was the federal courthouse, a guy named Tony Cardinelli, a good friend of ours, who did not see the value in this story, and there were others. Lee immediately saw what this could mean to America in terms of...
I won't go America. That's a little far, but certainly a good story.
Well, that's how I saw it, and I thought you saw it the same way. Maybe I gave you too much credit.
The injustice of it was what I saw.
But I saw it as a way, really, as I said earlier, to correct a real wrong in the system. And you don't have the opportunity to do that as a young lawyer. I was green. I took this case as much out of stupidity and as anything, because I did not know what I was going to be in for. In any event, that's a long answer to your question.
So then you add Lee Coppola, also not Swedish, Kenmore man suing U.S. to locate children, headlines, right? And that's launch. What, just out of curiosity, you sought out Lee, and Lee, what was your response to all this stuff?
Well, actually, Sal did not seek me out. I saw that little blurb in the paper that said Kenmore man sues the government for his kids, and I thought, how could this be that small a story? This sounds like a great story. It sounds like an injustice has been committed that a father can't see his kids. And then I saw that the attorney was Salvatore R. Martoche, and I said, wait a minute, didn't he go to Bishop Fallon High School with me? And wasn't he on the high school newspaper with me? And didn't he write a column by Sam Martoche about sports? Because he's a frustrated journalist anyway. So I called him. And I said, remember me from Bishop Fallon? And he said, yeah. And I said, you know, I'm interested. He says, come on over. And from that day on, he opened his files, introduced me to Tom Leonard and his wife, and I just kept writing about their attempts to get Tom's kids back to him, and basically the injustice of it. And that led to Patty Calabrese contacting me, and as Sal said, you know, he would come back to Buffalo, and we'd go to lunch at a restaurant, and I said, aren't you afraid? He said, they know where to get me. And I was sitting there having lunch with them, wondering if they get him, you know, bullets have a way of spreading. But Sal was mentioning Sam Gimbrone, and that's another end of the story, because Sam happened to be my wife's cousin. And so when this whole thing came down, and Patty wanted to talk to the media, Sam arranged for me to have a lengthy interview with Patty Calabrese. This was after the story was evolving, and I had interviewed the children were reunited with Tom Leonard in their teenage years, right, Sal? And I interviewed them about their life living with Patty Calabrese, and he didn't like some of the comments that the students made, so he wanted to correct that, and he called me on the phone. I said, well, then let's talk. So Sam Gimbrone arranged for me to interview him at his home in Hamburg. And as an aside about Sam Gimbrone, Sal mentioned how this was the first program, and they were flying by the seats of their pants. The way they got new identities for Patty Calabrese and not his wife, but Rochelle and the children is Sam Gimbrone went to his parish priest and had him make out phony baptismal certificates in new names, and that's how they got their new identities. Now, of course, the government takes care of it through Social Security and all kinds of formal new identities. But in those days, they didn't have anything to work with because there was no structure to the program. So I, as the Hide in Plain Sight kind of points out, I wrote a lot of stories about this, about the whole struggle and about Patty Calabrese, which turned into a book, which turned into a movie. So that was my involvement in Hide in Plain Sight. But I don't like the guy who played me.
Didn't bear much resemblance. Just, Tony, you came involved a little bit later, but you were also part of a strike force. And Judge Martoche was just talking about strike force, and the Patty Calabrese was really the first, certainly in Buffalo, success story of the strike force. And that was part of your early career as well, right?
Well, we're talking. Actually, these two guys to my right are a little older than me, so all this stuff.
You wouldn't know it.
All this stuff predated me by a little bit, but I came on board. I graduated from law school in '74, but I actually came on board with something that was known back then as the Buffalo Strike Force, which was a part of the Organized Crime and Racketeering section of the Department of Justice. We weren't part of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Started that in 1979. That being said, let me go back on
Sure.
the history of the strike force, and I know you're gonna learn about Elliot Ness or some stuff about Elliot Ness later. But if any of you have ever watched The Untouchables, the idea way back when with Ness and The Untouchables was let's get Al Capone literally on anything we can, anything. So that carried over, and Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General under his brother, John F. Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy absolutely, positively hated Jimmy Hoffa and felt that Jimmy Hoffa and the way that he ran the Teamsters was a cancer within the United States. So they set up within the Department of Justice about a 10-person dedicated squad, and they actually called them the Hoffa Squad. And they were dedicated to getting Jimmy Hoffa and putting Jimmy Hoffa in jail. And I won't go through the whole rigmarole of it, but they eventually succeeded. And I don't know if they sat around and said, okay, we put him in jail, what do we do now? But that was the genesis of the strike force. And they said, you know, this might work out in these cities where organized crime is, bugs up here, where organized crime is entrenched. And as Judge Martoche said, Buffalo was a little bit smaller mob family. It looked like they could use it as an incubator. And I just found this out last night, but they decided they could use it as an incubator. So they set up the Buffalo Strike Force, which was the first strike force of what became 16 strike forces around the United States, and populated those with Department of Justice prosecutors, and they went to work, and eventually I went to work with them. Started in '79. Eventually the strike forces were folded into the U.S. Attorney's offices. It was all made into one about 10 years later, and continued on with that to this day. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the death, or a lot, I guess, about the death of the mob in Buffalo, but that's not to say the mob is dead elsewhere. Certainly the mob families are flourishing, not to the degree that they were, but they're flourishing in New York City, and there's some other mob activity around the country. So that's kind of where I came from and got into where I was, and I did organized crime cases probably throughout my career. Less in the end, but that was more a product of the fact that there wasn't much in the end anyway in Buffalo in terms of organized crime.
Judge, you mentioned Gerald Schur, and was that was part of your case, but also you got to know him as well, Tony, didn't you? I mean, that was all.
Many times on the telephone. I never met Jerry Schur in person. And what Judge Martoche talks about was exactly what happened. I didn't know much about the hide in plain sight case, but I know that the witness security program was a work in progress, and probably still is a work in progress, because they're trying to take guys who are criminals, by and large, criminals in the city in which they are living, take them out of that environment, with or without families, put them in another environment, and turn them into productive citizens in Austin, Texas, or someplace like that. And you can see just by me saying that, that's a problem. And that's a problem that we had to deal with all the time. And Jerry Schur was the guy who was the captain of the ship, so to speak. He was the head of what we called enforcement operations. He had more responsibilities than just witness security, but he was the head of enforcement operations, and that's where the buck landed in terms of what to do with a particular person who was proposed for witness security. And like I said, it was an evolution. It improved. Did it ever become what it should have become, at least when I left? A resounding no. But
you know, Tony, when I became U.S. Attorney, Jerry Schur called me, and he said, "Can I take you to dinner?" And there was this place, Hausner's, I'll never forget it, in Baltimore, that was kind of a nifty old restaurant. It's now closed. And he and his wife took me to dinner. And he said to me, "You're the only person who ever sued me for $40 million that I like and respect." But he understood, and he told me at that time, he said, "You made a far bigger impact than I think you know." And he related that in a book that he co-wrote with a guy named Pete Early. He commented on that. So I really felt good about the fact that the people who knew the program knew that I had helped, by helping my client and by Lee helping us, that we had changed things for the better. Now there's all kinds of psychological testing. There's all kinds of concern about relocating children and where you're going to put people, and making sure that they don't go off the reservation, so to speak. There was a guy, Sam, what's his name, from the Ravenette Social Club, who was relocated.
Sammy the Bull, Sammy Gravano.
Yeah, Sammy the Gravano. And, he changed, he turned Arizona on its head in a matter of a couple of years. When you don't police these people, these are clever, smart people, and they don't go to Jesus simply because they've changed their identity. They're the same hoodlums that they were before. Now, the overwhelming number of people in the Witness Protection Program, the WITSEC, the Witness Program, were former criminals who had turned. There was a few people who were really sort of innocent bystanders, but not by and large.
Yes.
And the program also did some great work on the other big case. If we have time, I'll talk about that. It's interesting. This case preceded me as U.S. Attorney, and I think it had a big impact. And then the other case sort of took a U-turn and went back to the New York City area, and that was the Pizza Connection case. But the big flippers, the big informants and people who testified in that case who were Italians, who were Sicilians, were put in the Witness Protection Program. And so that it became almost an international program. Not almost, it did become a sort of an international program. But I was sitting by the pool in Florida in the wintertime, and I was thinking, you know, I was reading a memoir by Tom Canale, and he was talking in part of the memoir about the strike force and his experiences in Buffalo, how much he liked Buffalo, how much they were successful with the program. And he talked about the case, and I could tell that he had some regrets about not seeing ahead to the problems that were engendered. And I had met him at the premiere in Washington. They did a couple of premieres of Hide in Plain Sight prior to releasing it that I attended. One in New York City where I never forget. Mary D., were you with me then? Al Pacino on the phone, little tiny guy, made me feel tall, and it's hard. Anyway, and one in Washington for the congressional people. By the way, Jack Kemp was very helpful to me. We introduced a private bill that drove Kennelly and the people at DOJ crazy for a while because it almost had a life of its own. And it was sort of outside the box to do something like that. But we were saying to the government, give us this guy or give us this money. Now, if we had the money, we could hire the kind of investigators and do the kind of research that we were unable to do to try and uncover where they were. You know, there I was on a 4th of July party at my home after trying for 7 years to locate these kids, and I get a call from a woman. My wife answered the phone and said, there's a lady on the phone who wants to speak to you. I get on the phone and she says, Sal? Now remember, this is somebody I've never met. Hi, this is Ro. I said, Ro? She said, Rochelle. Rochelle Calabrese. Rochelle Leonard. And I said, Rochelle? You know, I was sort of dumbfounded. She said, I made a terrible mistake. I've left Patty. I'm starting a new life, and I want Tom to see the kids. The kids want to see Tom. And I'm saying to myself, she knows that I've made contact. Of course she knew because he interviewed them. A guy named Frank Cooper, who was what they call a packager, who put together the book and the movie. And I had made contact with him. He had made contact with Kennelly. Kennelly had brought Patty and Rochelle to him. They had a meeting, and she understood that she was going to be portrayed as a witch with a capital B in this in this story, and she wanted to change history a little bit for her own motives. I found out one awful, disturbing, terrible thing. I went out there and I talked to her and the children after Tom had made contact, and I found out that from the time she was about 13, Leonard had a relationship with Karen. I mean, Calabrese had a, thank you. Calabrese had a relationship with his stepdaughter. She was quite clear in saying he never, hit her, forced her, but at 13 it was statutory rape, and if it happened today, I personally called the district attorney's office in Reno to report this and got nowhere with them. He was already very lined up with organized crime. He was an entrepreneurial guy, and he saw that he could make a lot of money with law enforcement as a snitch. And so he became a professional snitch, and he went up and down. He worked on the Alaskan pipeline cases. He worked with, I'm talking about Calabrese. He worked with the RCMP on some Canadian cases. He even, I'll tell you what kind of guy he was. He went after a guy, befriended a guy in Maryland over years and years and years. And the guy was reluctant. He had a criminal record. He was reluctant to get involved with whatever the scam was, I don't recall, that Leonard wanted to get him involved in. I mean, that Calabrese, please forgive me, I keep saying, and so Calabrese was the best man at this fellow's wedding. I'm sure it wasn't his first wedding, but it was a wedding. And Calabrese then sets him up, winds up testifying against him, and puts him in jail as a multiple felony offender for a long time. He's just a wonderful human being, he was. He went, he had a private investigator's license not only in Nevada, but ultimately in Washington. He was 25 years, he was a PI in Spokane and Seattle. While he was in Spokane, he had a relationship with the head, one of the captains, I forgot now what branch he was in, but who was a silent partner, a $50,000 silent partner in a bar called Sherlock Holmes Cafe, which Patty owned. And finally, this guy had to resign from the police force. But I'm trying to show you the kind of guy he was. He was very capable of corrupting almost anybody around him and turning things to his own way. He was, along with a guy named Ronald Fino, one of the people who, in my experience, milked the government with mostly half-assed information, if you will, not really accurate, but what people wanted to hear and what people used. They both made a lot of money.
Can I get a question? This may be more for Lee. We saw in the movie, Patty Calabrese introduced to Don Vanuzzi. Now I realize that's just a fictitious name, but it also is Magaddino, I'm sure. And Lee, how did you kind of get into the interest of writing about organized crime? You entered the Buffalo News in 1967, fresh from, St. Bonaventure, and of all was it just such a hot item that you wanted to grab onto? Did somebody on the staff of Buffalo News saying, hey, Lee, why don't you just see if you can report on the Magaddino, something small?
No, that's not the way it happened. My name is Coppola. All of my grandparents came from Sicily. I grew up on the west side of Buffalo. Many of the people I grew up with took a different path in life, but I still knew who they were. When I was a kid, when things would happen that the mob was involved in, we knew who was involved. We knew who did the dirty deed. From the time I was a young boy, you wanted something done, you wanted a job, you went to see this guy or that guy because he had the connections. He was either wired to the mob or he was in the mob. So when I went to the news, I was a young reporter, and there was a murder involving a mobster, and I had some sources who indicated to me who it was, and I wasn't the police reporter at all. And I went to my editor and I said, well, you know, I said, I could do that story because I know a little bit about it. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I have some sources who can give me some information. He says, well, run with it. And basically that was the start of my career covering the mob. And much of it was because I had contacts either on the fringe of the mob and in some cases within the mob. So they provided me information about activities of the Buffalo mob, and, you know, it became a kind of a area of, quote, expertise. Sale was mentioning Sheriff Mike Amico and how he testified in Congress, and I remember Sheriff Amico later in life, some reporter from New York called him to ask him about organized crime, and he said, don't talk to me, call Lee Coppola at the news. Because he felt that I knew more about organized crime than he did. And I remember going through the police files regarding the Buffalo crime family. And many of the things in the police files were stories that I had written for the Buffalo News, and they had clipped and put into the police files. But you have to remember when you talk about the Buffalo crime family, which was led by Magaddino, it wasn't just Buffalo. Buffalo was the center of it. But Magaddino's crime family was a vast geographic area that extended all the way into Montreal, all the way to Youngstown, Ohio, all the way down to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and all the way past Rochester in New York State. And as Sale said, he was one of the few people, I think there were 26 families who created La Cosa Nostra in the 1930s, and he was one of the members of the original La Cosa Nostra, the 36 families. So he was a powerful human being, and nothing really happened in his territory unless he or his underlings approved it. And Patty Calabrese's testimony was basically the first time the government was able to put organized crime figures in jail because of someone giving testimony, one of their associates giving testimony in court. It was really the first chink in what the mob relied on for so many decades of omerta and of silence. And that, along with Valachi, excuse me, was one of the elements I credit for the demise of not only the Buffalo Mafia, but a lot of other mafia families, because when the old-timers from Sicily came over to the United States at the turn of the century, they were imbued with the loyalty, the fierce loyalty, they were imbued with the fear associated with it, and they were imbued with the secrecy, with the omerta. And then their sons got into the business, and maybe they were imbued with it also, but not so much. And then maybe their grandsons got into it. Now we're talking about the 60s and the 70s, and maybe they weren't imbued so much. And then things like, and I don't know if you want to get into this now, but you know, revenue sources started drying up. Sale mentioned prohibition. It was probably the worst thing that the government could do or the best thing actually for organized crime, because fortunes, literally fortunes, were made. When Al Capone was 27 years old, he grossed in today's money $1.3 billion because of his activities during Prohibition. So it was a fortune being made. And of course, those people who were running organized crime families, and Buffalo was a critical part of that operation because, as Judge Martoche said, we were close to Canada. So the good stuff would come across the border, and the Buffalo mob would then carry it down the East Coast or to Chicago and supply vendors in those areas. I call them vendors, but they were basically speakeasies, and they were vendors in those days. And then when Prohibition ended, the mob had to find other ways to make money. And there was bookmaking, of course, and there was loan sharking, of course, and there was the numbers racket, and there was gambling. Magaddino was the boss. One file I looked at reported that his take from 1 week of a card game that Italians love to play called Sigonette, his take was $25,000 in that 1 week. Now, what's happened to those revenue sources? We have the New York State Lottery, that takes care of numbers. We have casinos, that takes care of gambling. We have off-track betting, that takes care of bookmaking. So the revenue sources dried up, and the only revenue source, at least for the Buffalo Mob for many years, was an organization called Labor's Local 210. It was really run by the local mob. And then finally, the federal government got involved and came in and basically took over Local 210 and straightened it out. And so the demise comes from, if we want to talk about the demise of the Buffalo Mob, I call it the Americanization of the Buffalo Mob. The children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren of those loyal mafioso that came over from Sicily did not have the same loyalty that their forefathers had for this criminal empire. And so it dissipated, and then when the revenue sources dried up, it dissipated even further. So that in a simple summary is why, in my opinion, there is no longer a mafia in Buffalo.
Tony, you discussed, and by the way, what Lee talked about is in the book, which again, you'll get once you give us your email address. Also, there's a wonderful slideshow which has been presented by Tony on RICO. RICO, which the Racketeering Act really was adopted in 1970. Magaddino was still alive at the time, but really didn't take full effect until the 80s. There was sort of a time lag. Why was that? Was it just prosecutors getting used to what it really meant?
I think it was a learning curve. RICO was put together by a Notre Dame law professor who is older than anybody at this table, by the name of Bob Blakey, who, if you ever talked to Bob Blakey, you'd say, this guy's a genius. I don't know if anybody's met him, but he's really something. He put it together, and nobody really understood it or started using it for about 8, 9, 10 years after it came into the law, which was from basically 1970 to 1980. In 1980, it started to be used, and it really took off because prosecutors started to understand how to use it, and they understood the wide-ranging effects and the huge number of people that you could scoop into a racketeering prosecution that you couldn't do by picking somebody off, for instance, by robbing the treasurer's office at Buffalo City Hall. And that's how it really got steam or got wind in its sails and got used after that. You're going to get, I think, a handout that I did.
Yes.
I learned how to use it, I think, fairly well, and I found it to be a wonderful statute. And every time I'd propose it to another assistant U.S. attorney for use in their case, they'd say, oh my God, it's too much work to do. Well, everybody to his or her own opinion, but it's like, do you want to drive out of the showroom with a Chevy Aveo, or do you want to drive out of the courtroom with a Mercedes 5 Series? I kind of preferred the 5 Series myself.
So explain it. We've heard the term RICO, racketeering, in layman's term, and because this is it. This is the handout right here. It's fantastic presentation. And I don't know, maybe Ed, if is it possible to, maybe we can put some of that up. There it is. And maybe if we can flip through and talk a little bit about it. We'll show it when you talk about it. I don't need to.
Racketeering is really enterprise crime. It's a group of individuals.
You want to bring the mic a little bit closer, Tony?
Sure.
Thank you.
Although you can prosecute an individual under RICO, it's really not aimed to prosecute individuals. It's aimed to prosecute a group of individuals that get together and on an organized basis go out and commit crimes. Not a particular crime, not a robbery of the Treasury at City Hall, but they make it their business Their business is committing crimes, by and large, to put revenue into their own pockets. And it's really diverse. It takes in a whole slew of perhaps 200 federal statutes. It takes in, I think, 17 state types of statutes. And believe it or not, you can prosecute state crimes in federal court as long as you bring them in under RICO. And it just is an incredibly powerful tool in the hands of the prosecutor who's looking at a group who just makes money and terrorizes people off criminal activity.
So, as a practical matter, the guy who's the driver of a car, even in Calabrese's case, that wasn't in play then in 1967, but at the time, and all of a sudden you arrest the driver who's got the goods in the car, all of a sudden you can bring him in as part of the enterprise. Isn't this as far-reaching as getting people who can become scared and flipping and as they...
Well, that's a little bit apples and oranges. A driver in a bank robbery is an aider and abetter, and he can be prosecuted. But what you've got here is you've got everybody who's a member of the enterprise is potentially exposed to criminal prosecution, because if they agree to commit 2 acts of racketeering as a part of the enterprise, they can be prosecuted for racketeering, even if they themselves didn't participate in it. That's a RICO conspiracy, which is a whole afternoon spent here. But
that is sort of controversial, had been, the fact that the crime did not have to be actuated, that there was the crime here was the mere conspiracy, the mere discussion of it, and it caused significant debate in the legal community for a long time, but it was very, very effective.
Let me give you an example that last U.S. attorney that I worked under, when he was a line assistant, he prosecuted a group of individuals who were really the Bloods and the Crips, and they were running a narcotics conspiracy primarily on Buffalo's east side. But they had a guy, his name was Reese Johnson. Do you remember this guy? Reese Johnson was a stone-cold killer. And eventually they brought a separate RICO case against Reese Johnson, and it had in it, as I recall, 5 homicides that he had committed. 4 of them he had committed in Buffalo, and they were ordered homicides, they were hits. The 5th homicide he had committed in Memphis or Nashville or someplace like that. And you're saying to yourself, why is this guy talking about a homicide in Tennessee? It was prosecuted in Buffalo because it was committed as a part of the enterprise. And so they were able to take the Tennessee prosecutor's evidence, introduce it in a Buffalo courtroom, and he was convicted of committing a murder in Tennessee under the RICO statute because he committed it as a part of the enterprise. So you can see the tentacles are incredible. And that's an extreme situation, but the tentacles are incredible. Back in the heyday when the Philadelphia mob was under heavy scrutiny, and they still are, but under heavy scrutiny by the FBI, the Philadelphia mob, there was this thing called the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River, and they were the borders between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Well, they didn't care about those. They went into New Jersey and they committed crimes. They committed crimes in Pennsylvania. And again, they were able to scoop all of these crimes into a single indictment and prosecute those crimes in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So it's an incredible tool. You can run. You can run, but you can't hide.
I think just to go back for a moment, to understand organized crime a little better, you need, and I'm sure we're going to get some information at lunch on this, but you go back to the old country, as they say, Sicily and Italy. The La Cosa Nostra is the Sicilian Mafia. The Sicilian Mafia is only one of a number of organized crime communities in the Naples area. It's called the Camorra. In the other areas, there's the Negrata. There are crime families, some more brutal, than the Mafia. It grew up at the time, you know, Italy's only been a country since 1871. Before that, there was the north of Italy with really the prosperous Italians, and the area that they refer to as the Mezzogiorno. The Mezzogiorno is 2/3 of the Italian peninsula plus Sardinia and Sicily. Now, they were people, the Mezzogiorno was a term that meant half day. And it meant that these were lazy people who only worked a half a day. Well, they were working mostly in fields in phenomenal heat and being treated like slaves or serfs most of their lives, so they didn't have a lot of incentive to work. And it was brutal. Life was brutal for those people. And this, before the unification of Italy, it was even worse, and there was a time they called it the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And there were two capitals, one in Palermo, Sicily, and one in Naples on the mainland. And with the oppressions, the only thing that changed was the face of the oppressor. Was he Austrian? Was he French? They kept having fights. And there were these little duchies and little areas within what is now Italy that were trying to survive, and sometimes they fought with one another. I say this because out of that grew a group of, we would call them terrorists if you didn't like them, or patriots if you did like them, who grew up and they would do things to attack the power structure in these people. They would rob from the rich and give to the poor. But after a while, it became perverted. It became a group of young toughs who decided that they were going to get theirs, and who learned this lesson of how to exploit the peasants and the merchants in their area. Now, if you understand that, you understand more the blood loyalty that Lee just referred to that is diminished as the mob in the United States changed. You also can see that they based their whole structure on the Roman legions. That's the way the Mafia was formed. And other organized crime or semi-organized crime or trying to be organized crime groups, whether in South America, in the hoods of Los Angeles and New York City, whether Colombian drug dealers, they tried to model as much as they could that discipline. And you find that in organized crime, if you belong to the wrong gang, if you belong to the wrong, in the semi-organized crime. Now, the organized crime figures in the traditional sense have taken advantage of this change as they have changed and morphed. They see new opportunities, and they saw, for one, that they could be the bankroll in a lot of situations for these other organized crime figures. Particularly bikers were involved in working with the Mafia and the mob in drugs for many, many years. Certain bikers, bike clubs that have been now hopefully diminished in their power. So that there's always this changing that's going on. Today, question of whether organized crime still exists, that's another question we'll talk about. But you'll find that there is more activity in telemarketing and what they call pump and dump schemes. You pump up a stock, and you get money, and you buy, you build it up, other people buy, you get out, get your money, and it's very hard to prove in many cases. So they're always adapting. And somebody says, well, is there organized crime? Well, not maybe the way we knew it. As Lee wrote an article about 25 years ago called The Withering Arm, and I love that title. I still remember the article. And he said that they were the mob in Western New York, which they called the Arm. That's why the Withering Arm. The arm was injured. It wasn't severed, but it was injured. 20 years later, another reporter named Dan Herbeck said basically the same thing. But there's some guys, particularly in Canada, who say it's not dead, it's alive. Well, what do you mean by alive? Do you mean that criminals are still criminals and money is still money and people who are criminals are going to try and find a way to get some of that? Tony Bruce knows that if that's your definition, they're still alive and well. And but I don't know if it's the same. I don't think it is. Tony is closer to it in terms of inside information on that maybe than I am, and maybe he should talk about that.
Before we get Tony, hang in there, Tony, because we're coming right at you. The Withered Arm, the death of the Buffalo Mafia, is all about losing its old-fashioned values and falling behind the times, by Lee Coppola, Saturday, January 31st, 1998.
It wasn't 25 years ago.
The first paragraph, the bills, more than $500,000 in denominations from 1 to 1,000 were old and musty. When FBI agents found them hidden in an attic trunk, it marked the beginning of the downfall of the Buffalo Mafia. Once among the most powerful crime families in the nation, the Buffalo Mob, with its tentacles stretching into Canada, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, slowly disintegrated after the cash was discovered in the home of the son of the crime family's godfather. You talked about Magaddino. You talked about this article. It was an incredible article. I commended it. It's on, you can find it on the internet. And I think it's going to be part of the information as well. When you wrote the article, January 31st, 1998, did your phone ring off the hook?
I wish I could say it did, but I did get some phone calls, and it was basically people in law enforcement who were saying to me, "What do you mean the mob no longer exists?" And I remember a quote, for that article, I interviewed an attorney who represented mobsters, a fine man named Harold Boreanaz. And I said, Harold, I was just over to the head of the FBI, and he said that their task force, their organized crime task force, is very busy because the mob is still entrenched in Buffalo. And he looked at me and he said, well, Lee, let me tell you, he said, if your job was to go into the forest and count the trees, would you come back and say there's no trees? And I said, oh, I see what you're saying. So I kind of went based on my sources in the mob, or what then was a shadow of the mob, and what Harold said. I just took the calls I was getting from law enforcement people as saying, hey, don't ruin our thing here. Our job is to investigate organized crime, and if you say there's no organized crime, people might get wind of that. So those are the only calls I really got.
Within the article, it said, today the empire is all but expired. Perhaps the final gasp came last year when the mob lost control of Buffalo Laborers Local 210, for decades a base of mob power. Tony, was that part of your world as far as prosecuting those? Was RICO part of that storyline dealing with the Buffalo Laborers Local 210?
Yes and no. What happened with Local 210 is we looked at 210 under a magnifying glass for a long time, and we were able to lop off a few guys here and there and prosecute them, but we were never able to mount what I would call an enterprise prosecution against Local 210. Then we said, let's look at this from a different angle. And RICO has, it's not in any of my slides, but it has a civil aspect to it. And in a civil lawsuit, you can do a hell of a lot more, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, you can do a hell of a lot more than you can in a criminal lawsuit. You can sue somebody with a modicum of evidence and a theory, and then you can go around and you can take depositions and you can ask them to answer interrogatories and do a whole lot of things, and in large part ask the other side to fill in the blanks of your case with you, or for you. So the Department of Justice brought a civil RICO case against Local 210, and Local 210 essentially laid down and let it happen and allowed themselves to be put into a receivership, and the receiver, the man who oversaw the receivership was, here's a funny situation, was a retired FBI agent. And he basically took over and ran Local 210 for 5 or 6 years, tossed out all the guys that we thought, or at least assumed were organized crime members, and brought a modicum of democracy into that union, and ridded it of the organized crime influence at that point in time. Let me comment on, let me jump forward. We discussed this last night. Let me comment on what happens with a union and how a union becomes a cancer, a corrupt union becomes a cancer on society. I prosecuted a number of members of Local 17, which was the operating engineers in Buffalo. And my very first witness on the stand was a guy by the name of John Williams, who's this really tough businessman from Niagara Falls. And John Williams ran several construction companies, and they were all non-union, and he fought at every turn, he fought with Local 17 because they wanted to come in and they wanted to unionize his companies, and he would have wound up paying a lot more money, and his various employees wouldn't have gotten anything out of it, at least in his theory. So I brought him in, and he was a very powerful witness. They tried to shake him down. Brought him in, got him ready for trial, spent, I don't know, maybe 3.5 hours with him. And as we finished up, I shook his hand, as I always do with witnesses like that, and he said, I want to thank you. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I want to thank you. He said, I want you to look at Buffalo out there. I want you to look at the building that's going on in Buffalo, the conversions of warehouses into lofts, the money that's being spent, the speculation that's going on. And I said, okay. He said, you guys are responsible for that. And I said, what do you mean? He said, by prosecuting these guys, you got them off our backs, and for years we paid a street tax of about 25% to Local 17. We don't have to pay that anymore. Now we can go out and we can take that roughly 25%. We can speculate, we can spend money, we can do building projects, things of that nature. And he said, that's what you've done for the city of Buffalo. Same thing applied for Local 210. I mean, Local 210 was on the backs of contractors. They were taking money off the backs of contractors. And when you build a project, if you think about it, if you want to build a project, a warehouse or a business premises or an apartment building or something like that from the ground up, you need the operating engineers, you need Local 210, you need those unions, or you need those types of laborers to do the job. And if you're getting overcharged because you're getting shaken down, the money to do other things just isn't there. So that's kind of the background on Local 210, but from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, we have a slide up on the Local 17 case, U.S. versus Mark Kirsch.
Certainly not in Italian.
And but it also, the case actually wound its way through the federal court system. Judge Scredny,
Yes.
who's been here, was part of that and made some rulings which were really reflected the Hobbs Act and U.S. versus Emmons. Just to kind of drill down a little bit, the case, because it is so recent, it's a 2018 case.
Well, Kirsch's appeal, his last appeal was, Judge Scredny was affirmed. Mark Kirsch is on his way to jail, so the case, I'm gone, but the case still has a life, and actually Mark Kirsch is not quite in jail yet. But it was one of the hardest fought cases I think I was involved in the U.S. Attorney's Office, because there were some pretty good lawyers on the other side and there's a lot of arcane case law and whatnot that deals with labor and labor racketeering. We fought that sucker right down to the wire. And there's this case out there, it's called U.S. versus Edmonds, and I won't bore you with it, but Edmonds talks about when you can use the federal extortion statute and when you can't use the federal extortion statute in labor racketeering prosecutions. And the defense attorneys kept saying, this is an extortion statute-based labor racketeering case. Edmunds applies, Edmunds applies, Edmunds applies. I almost walked from the courthouse to the office every time I walked out of a hearing and saying, Edmunds, Edmunds, Edmunds. We also charged in it the parallel New York State extortion statute. Again, as I said, we could use state statutes in federal prosecutions. And Judge Scretany said, Edmunds does not apply to the New York State extortion statute. And we went to trial, and it was really a mixed verdict. There were a couple guys acquitted, but Mark Hirsch was convicted. And he was convicted, strangely enough, on the New York State extortion statutes, which were part of the RICO prosecutions. And then Judge Scretany later, as I recall, dismissed the federal extortion charges in it, but left us hanging by a thread, but it's a conviction, left us hanging by a thread because we were able to use the state extortion statutes. And good friends of mine, Rod Personius, went down to the Second Circuit and argued till he was blue in the face that this Edmunds case, which had this sort of black cloud over the federal extortion statute, should be applied to the state extortion statute, and the Second Circuit gave him a resounding no. So there we are. I think that answers your question.
Well, it's a fascinating case. It does tie in with local union 210, local union 17, brings us current. And as you, we're got a lot to continue to talk about, but curious, Lee, in your analysis of crime reporting on Magaddino's and his extensive territory, runs up to Montreal and all the way to Youngstown, did Magaddino's have such power where did he move people around so that somebody that perhaps wasn't working well in his nearby territory of Buffalo might end up in Youngstown, or just sort of, did he have that sort of territorial power?
Well, a brief history. The original, what we came to be known as the Arm, at the turn of the century, when Sicilian criminals came to the Buffalo area, they were called the Black Hand, not La Cosa Nostra, not the Mafia. They called themselves the Black Hand. And the head of the Black Hand at that time was a guy by the name of Joseph DiCarlo. He had come from Sicily, and he organized these bands of criminals into something called the Black Hand. Well, then he had a son named Joseph DiCarlo, and he wanted Joseph DiCarlo to take over the family. Magaddino came from New York City, I think about 1920, 1921, and when he came to Buffalo to run his empire. And Joe DiCarlo was running a smaller empire, but was running the empire at that time. And Magaddino sent him to Youngstown, Ohio. And Joe DiCarlo Jr. ran Youngstown, Ohio for like 30 or 40 years as part of the Magaddino family. And as far as switching people around, after Calabrese's testimony, and some of the leaders of the Buffalo mob were sent to jail, he obviously had to fill those positions. And that was tenuous in a lot of ways, too, because people vied to come in and take over the role of, say, Freddie Randazzo or Pat Titters or the people who were going to jail. And so he had to negotiate all these things. And, from what my experience in dealing with people who dealt with him, I've heard it said many times that if he could have used his skills in negotiating and arranging and run a Fortune 500 company. That's how they say how wise he was and how skillful he was in maneuvering. He was not the kind of person who went out cabareting. He was not the kind of person who went to nightclubs. He was a very simple, quote, simple family man. His brother was his top henchman, and his brother did all the messages to the various elements of his empire. And people who were receiving orders thought that his brother was actually the godfather. when it was Stefano Magaddino who was the godfather.
Talk about Magaddino. You talked about Magaddino. Was a real-life godfather, not just in Niagara Falls and Buffalo, but in Ontario, parts of Ohio, and Pennsylvania. He was one of a handful of men who founded the Mafia's National High Commission, a group of 12 crime lords he reportedly ruled in the mid-1950s. Each Mafia family in the United States had a seat on the commission, and Magaddino and his fellow crime commissioners met periodically to settle disputes, determine what crimes were allowed and what families would control them. It was just such a meeting in 1957 at Appalachian, a rural area near Binghamton, that first alerted the nation to the nationwide criminal organization. We drive down 86 and we see Appalachian. I've in fact pulled over. Next thing you know, I'm up in the hills there and find the location, because to me it was sort of a tourism destination. Talk a little bit about what that was all about, only because I think it's an incredible historical curiosity, and there are some, and Magaddino was the guy who sort of orchestrated that.
Yeah, the meeting was supposed to be at the estate of Joseph Barbera in Appalachia, and Magaddino, who was on the commission at that time, and was vying with other members of the commission, wanted to establish his authority in the national empire. And he demanded that the meeting of these crime families take place within his region. The head of the Chicago family was against it, but he went along with it. And because of the fact that the state police and other police agencies raided the Barbera estate, and so many mobsters were arrested. By the way, none of them were ever convicted. Many of them were arrested, none of them were ever convicted. Because of that, Magaddino's power within the criminal empire was diminished. And because of that also, J. Edgar Hoover, who had never really acknowledged the existence of a national criminal empire, finally had to recognize that existed. And unfortunately, because of the way he recognized it, he sent agents out to do anything they could to arrest mob members throughout the various crime families. And many of the arrests were, all of the arrests that subsequently followed the Barbera raids by federal agents, all of them were dismissed because the agents broke the law when they were trying to get evidence against these mobsters. But it was Barbera's estate and the raid that really forced Hoover to recognize that he knew there was something there, but he didn't want to pursue anything like that because he didn't want to get his hands dirty with organized crime. He preferred to build statistics on bank robberies and kidnappings so that he could have more influence in Congress.
I forget who was telling the story last night and about Barbera, and he had the Canada Dry. Was that you, Tony? Tell that it's an interesting, fascinating story.
Well, I have a now deceased uncle who went into business with a Canada Dry and related soft drink business.
Tony, you want to just come a little bit closer to the mic?
Yeah. He went into business with a Canada Dry and related bottling company business in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Bottled Canada Dry, Dr. Pepper, everything except, I think, Coke, Pepsi, and 7-Up. And the way you sold is you had a territory, and you sold into your territory, and you bought your territory from Canada Dry, and your territory was a commodity that you could sell to somebody else. Well, Joseph Barbera, strangely enough, had a Canada Dry bottling company in Binghamton, New York. And he had this finger of territory that reached down to northern Pennsylvania, north of Scranton there, which infuriated my uncle. He wanted to have it, et cetera, et cetera. So he decided he was going to approach Joseph Barbera and try and buy this finger of territory from him so that he would have all of northeast Pennsylvania as a part of his territory and not this one little carved out area. So he hiked up his pants and he got his courage up and talked to the various people in his family, and he was off to Binghamton to meet with Joseph Barbera, I think shaking in his boots, that he had to meet this mob guy and try and cut a deal with him. So he got to Barbera's place of business, and according to my uncle, and this was a story he told me many years ago, it was just the opposite of what he thought. He said he proposed a price to Barbera. Barbera pounded his fist on the table and he said, "It's yours." And that was pretty much the end of the negotiations. Back then, if you remember, you used to buy soft drinks in returnable bottles from the store. So that glass, as they called it in the industry, was very, very important because it was very, very expensive. And Barbera actually threw in a truckload of glass, which showed up at my uncle's place in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, shortly after that. So I guess you could say my blood family has had some dealings with the mob somewhere along the line. So,
And you changed your name to protect the innocent, yeah.
no, actually, I'm half Italian, but the Italian's on my mother's side. And in due deference to the two gentlemen to my right, they were from the north of Rome, from the right side of the tracks, so to speak.
The rich side of it.
The rich side of the tracks,
They're
absolutely.
really Swiss.
Yeah.
Well, no, he's right. My maternal grandmother was actually born in the Italian portion of Switzerland. My grandfather was born in a little dinky town, which I've been to, about 10, 12 miles north of Pisa in Italy. So, yeah, we were on the correct side of the tracks.
I wish we had time to get into Rochester. And I mean, the organized crime situation in Rochester is the most interesting, exciting, and it was the one when I was U.S. Attorney, was involved most with. They had the A team and the B team, and people were shooting each other. It was really like Chicago during Prohibition.
Let me hit the ground running in that and go through that in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something
We
like
got
that.
time, we got some time.
Okay. Way back when, there was a mob murder of a guy by the name of Jimmy the Hammer Massaro. He was murdered on orders of Red Rosati, who was the head of the mob, and the orders were given at Rosati's house, which was in Penfield, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, and in New York State, to convict somebody, you need corroboration for the testimony of someone who was involved in the crime. He didn't have any. So some enterprising Monroe County Sheriff's deputies did what you always do. They cooked up the corroboration. They actually wrote surveillance notes saying they had surveilled this meeting, and they put them in the toaster. So they did cook it up. And they got on the stand, and they put, I can't remember who the guy was on the stand, but they put him on the stand. He testified, "I was there at the meeting." Truthfully, the murder was ordered, it occurred, et cetera, and then the sheriff's deputies followed, and they testified that they had done a surveillance and they had seen this meeting occurred. So now they had the accomplice corroborated, and these guys went to prison. And it fell apart. And what happened was, I'm not sure how it fell apart, but the fact that the sheriff's deputies had cooked up this corroboration evidence came to light. Several of them went to jail for perjury, and lo and behold, the state had to go in and actually dismiss the murder indictment against these bad guys. And they were bad guys, trust me. In the meantime, they were Team A. They became known as Team A. They had left the group, sort of their underlings, who became known as Team B, for bombers, I might add, in charge. And it was maybe 4 or 5 years that they spent in jail before they came back out, and they said, "Okay, you guys took good care of it, we want it back." And the Team B guys said no, probably in much stronger terms, but they said no. And a mob war in Rochester erupted. A guy by the name of Sammy Gingello, who was kind of the John Gotti of Rochester, out cabareting, nightclubs, et cetera, was blown up in his car. There was a machine gunning, which is a story in and of itself, of one of the Team B guys in a motel in Victor, New York, and it was a regular old mob shootout. The Team B guys actually they were trying to put tricycles out in front of people's houses loaded with explosives so they could blow them up remotely as these guys came out to get in their car and whatnot. So long story short, I had just come on board in the strike force, and the Team B prosecution was just about to get started. And there were some personnel problems in the strike force, and this is my personal story. And they came to me and they said, well, we hired you because we think you're good. We think you know what the heck you're doing. If we can't get this personnel problem lined up, you're trying the case. And I'm like, I'm doing what? Well, fortunately, those problems got themselves resolved. They went in, they tried the case, all of the defendants were convicted, they all went to jail for long periods of time. And then they turned around and they indicted Team A. Now, they were eventually had, as I said, they had the state murder conviction vacated. The state murder conviction was then used in the federal prosecution. It's not double jeopardy because it's what they call dual sovereigns. Our office, not yours truly, but our office prosecuted the Team A group, and most, I think 7 of the 10 members of Team A that went to trial were convicted, went to jail for very, very long periods of time. I think some of them are still in jail. I'm not sure about that. Many of them have died. And then while they were putting that case on, they sat around and they decided, okay, Team A has left yet another group in charge. Let's see what we can do to take them down. And that brought me in, and I wound up prosecuting what I call the AAA Farm Club of Team A. After Team A went to jail, one of the main guys in Team A was a guy by the name of Picaretto. I can't think of Picaretto's first name. Rene Picaretto. The Team A AAA Farm Club was run by his son, who was Lauren Picaretto, and there were several others. There were 8 or 9 defendants. Many of them went to, or many of them pled guilty, but 2 of them, or 3 of them actually, 4 of them actually went to trial. And I'll tell you what pieces of shit the mob is. I'm not going to sugarcoat
How do you
this.
really feel, though?
Yeah. One of the guys who went to trial in my sort of AAA case and was convicted, he was convicted only of conspiracy, which I was a little surprised at, but he was convicted only of conspiracy. And Judge Larimer let these guys stay out on bail pending sentencing. And here's this guy who's this, stud, mobster, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden a report lands on my desk that he's molesting a little boy. So we went back to Judge Larimer, and it took Judge Larimer all of maybe half a day to jail this guy. But that just shows you that these guys, they're honor, they've got this code, and excuse my French again, they're pieces of shit.
There's one other aspect to this I want to mention. In its zeal to get these people off the streets, as often is a danger, and why the lawyers at the Justice Department need to be so careful when they're examining the police officers, the police agencies that are involved in these prosecutions. There was fabricated information that was used to commit, to convict a number of them, Red, Renee, Sammy G.
That was a Team A state prosecution.
Those were all overturned, and the sheriff and a number of other people in Rochester, Monroe County wound up going to jail themselves during my tenure. I remember that very well, and it was a great lesson about the corrupting influences, not only with the bribery and the obvious things, but with the zeal that you're trying to do the best you can, and you forget the Constitution and the protections and the way you're supposed to work. And it's a very fine line, and it's hard not to fall off when you're dedicated and you're trying. But this is a danger, and this is why people like Tony Bruce have their hands full, because they've got to evaluate the information that comes before them, and they have a duty. They've taken an oath not to present evidence when they know it may be compromised or that there was some unethical conduct.
You were a U.S. attorney, Judge, and was Lee and Tony part of your world?
Tony was. Lee has been part of my world since we went to high school. I mean, so Tony was in the strike force, a young strike force lawyer. There were a couple of other guys there. There was a guy named Dick Endler, who ran the strike force in those days, and there was a guy named Dennis O'Keefe, who was a really good guy. But Tony was obviously the guy on the fast track, and he was zealous, hardworking, talented, and not afraid. He was a real warrior. And that made him, I think, from the time he was there, the guy that, he tried more cases, strike force cases, I think, than anybody in Buffalo history, and made an impact. Some people would say, some defendants, and not a few lawyers would say he was maybe a little too zealous. Sometimes he was, but he was a tremendous prosecutor, and I think really exemplifies why the mob was in many ways withered.
One of the things that makes me kind of proud of my career is I had a fairly large retirement party, and a huge number of defense attorneys showed up. So I couldn't have been all bad.
What?
I couldn't have been all bad.
No, you weren't. No. I'm just saying that there was a group who, particularly when they just got off trial and they beat the heck out of him, who would complain about him. But that's not unusual. That happens.
One of the things Sal, as a U.S. attorney, used to complain about is I would do a story about organized crime, and the FBI would accuse him of leaking it to me, and he would accuse the FBI of leaking it to me. And I was really using an FBI informant to give me the information, but he was caught in between the FBI, and nobody knew where the story came from.
Yeah, they thought that I was leaking things. I was sure they were leaking things, and it was one of their informants who was leaking things. His initials were Ron Fino. I just...
we had many people who asked in advance, would we be naming names? I said, no.
Just a few.
No.
I just want to close with one thing that's very important to me, and it's the Pizza Connection case. Now, I don't know how many people remember that case, but in my opinion, it was probably the most significant organized crime prosecution in the history of these kinds of prosecutions. Now, that case had a Buffalo connection, of course, because the narcotics, the heroin that was coming in from Sicily was coming in on pallets that were hollowed out, which had tile, that went to a little tile shop in North Buffalo on Delaware Avenue, run by a very quiet, unassuming guy who most organized crime guys knew nothing about. And that was a guy named Aiello, Andrea Aiello. And ultimately, this stuff would go back to Brooklyn and would be sent to pizza companies, pizza parlors all over the country, and they were the source. They were the source of for the individuals who wanted to buy it. Anyway, we thought that the case should be a Buffalo case because that's where the initial arrests were made. And I found out a little bit about the politics, the inside politics of the Justice Department in a very hard way. There was a guy named Ray Deary, who was the U.S. attorney in the Eastern District, who wanted the case and told me why he should have it and why I shouldn't. And I said, you just want it because you can have it. He says, that's right. He says, I can get it, and I'm going to get it. Well, he didn't count on a guy named Rudy Giuliani who wanted it also. And so when Rudy did to him what he did to me by taking that case, he was offended. In any event, it was the longest prosecution, I believe, in the history of the federal courts. It was over a year. Yeah. And the important part is not only were there 20-some convictions there, but that is the case which put the Italian mob on trial in a huge, big way. 100 and, what was it, how many? It was over 100 people were tried in a mass trial in Italy. And there were tremendous numbers of convictions. And in fact, I met two guys whose paths I would cross. There was a guy named Louis Free, who was one of the two lead prosecutors in that case, who then became the head of the FBI. And when he was working as an AUSA, him and a guy named Richard Martin were in the Southern District, and they were responsible for this trial. And it was a phenomenal piece of work. But Free invited me to his swearing in when he became the head of the FBI, when he was named director. And as he was, a funny story, as he was coming out of the courtyard where the ceremony was held, I was standing near a doorway, and he came to that doorway, and he saw me, and he was just a little bit ahead of President Clinton, who was with his Secret Service agent. And when he saw me, he said, "Sally," and he gave me a big hug. "This is Free." Now the president is looking out of his eye and wondering who the hell this fat guy in the doorway is that's so important. At the same time, he comes forward with his body man, and it's a guy named Richard Miller, who had been my Secret Service agent when I was Assistant Secretary at the Treasury. And so they both stuck out their hands at the same time, and Rich said, "Mr. Secretary," and we shook hands, and the president is just scratching his head, wondering who the heck we are. I said, "That was a great choice in Louis Free," although years later I'm sure that he didn't agree with me, as they had some arguments through the years. But Free was a heck of a prosecutor, and that case was monumental, as I'm sure Tony would agree.
And there's a journalistic element to this whole thing, because I had a source in the FBI who was telling me something big was going down, and we found out that they were going to hit a house where this Andrea Aiello lived in North Buffalo, and we found out that they were massing at Mickey D's on Delaware Avenue. So at the time, I was working for Channel 7, and we had a brown undercover van that we used to use to do undercover stories. So with my photographer and a producer, we drove to the thing, and we saw all these cars pulling out of this lot, and it was obviously FBI. So we pulled into the line, and the last car waved us in because they thought we were part of the FBI entourage. So we followed the FBI line of cars to this Andrea Aiello's house, which was on a side street in North Buffalo. And of course, they all jumped out, and the guy with the battering ram went up to the door, and my photographer got out, and he said, "Lee, should I put on the light?" I said, "Yeah, this is dark. You got to take video." Well, actually, yeah, video. So they started banging the door, and somebody turned around, and he said, "Thank God somebody thought enough to bring a light." So that we were journalistically involved in the arrest of Andrea. And then, of course, we followed them back to the shop on Delaware, and one of my sources conveniently opened the garage door so I could take video of them going through the pallets and finding the drugs.
So, which brings it kind of to an interesting story I stumbled onto just a few minutes ago, where, Lee, you talked about the fall of the Omerta, and you talked about a guy named Omerta, like I said. Here. John Sacco.
Oh, God.
Can you tell that story, because it's just
Johnny
apropos.
Sacco was a guy who was wired to the Buffalo crime family, which at the time was headed by a man named Joseph Tadaro, who's now dead. And Johnny was kind of like one of their gopher guys, but he would arrange things. In fact, Tony and I just talked about an incident involving Johnny Sacco.
400 pounds of solid muscle.
Right. And he ran a sportsman's club on Connecticut Street. Now, Joe Tadaro, the Godfather, wanted to have his son make his bones. And in the Mafia, in order to make your bones, meaning an inside member of the Mafia, you either have to kill someone or participate in a killing. So Johnny Sacco and 4 other people were at this Connecticut Street Sportsman's Club, and Johnny lured this guy named Frosty Novino, to the Sportsman's Club, and they were gonna kill him, and the Tadaro was gonna make his bones. Well, Faust walked in and recognized immediately that...
Hold on one second. Faust Novino was one of the toughest MFers you ever came across.
Right.
He was a bricklayer. He was not a big guy, but he was one solid muscle. And he always carried, I understood it was a pearl handle 45 in the back of his pants wherever he went, because he was not a liked guy, among other things. Go ahead.
So he walks into the Sportsman's Club, he senses what's going on. Johnny Sacco has a gun, but Faust Novino pulls his gun out, and he shoots Johnny Sacco twice in the stomach and then runs. And of course, then everybody scatters. Somebody calls the police and the ambulance. And as Sacco is being taken out, the police are asking him, Johnny, who shot you? And he's going, nobody shot me. And he's got 2 bullet holes in his stomach. So that's omerta. That's loyalty to the family. There was another guy, a guy by the name of Jack Valenti, who was a mob hitman in New York City. He died in 1981, and there was a little obituary in the New York City paper about him. And the person who wrote the obituary was talking to a detective in the New York City Police Department, and they asked him about Valenti. And the detective said he was one of the old timers. He said, you could hang him by his thumbs for 6 weeks. He might tell you his first name. That was omerta. And that's what really that was the crack in the Mafia, was when omerta was starting to erode.
Well, even the story goes on Sacco, it eroded with him.
Yeah. I was just going to say.
Go ahead, finish the story.
Sacco went to prison for a long time. I can't remember exactly how long. And then he came out. He was on parole. And shortly after he was out, he got caught figuratively with his pants down, and he rolled. And he was ready to testify, except he died.
Well, yeah, and he rolled, but everything he was telling the FBI was a fantasy. I mean, he was playing the FBI, and these sources would tell me what he was telling them, and I said, he's playing you like a fiddle. Everybody knows that on the street. He's not giving you any new information. And supposedly he rolled because his son was caught on drugs in Arizona, and he wanted to protect his son from being prosecuted in Arizona. But then he died in jail, had a heart attack.
400-pound guy.
Man, well, that'll happen.
Just to draw, we're going to try to draw a circle. We've got about 20 more minutes. Judge Martoche, Tom Leonard, Calabrese, do a life after the story. Rochelle, the kids, where are they now?
Well, a lot of them are dead. Rochelle Calabrese died of cancer in Reno, Nevada, where she lived. And Patty Calabrese spent 25 years as a private investigator up in the state of Washington, Spokane and Seattle. And he wound up dying up there also. The children, well, Michael still lives in Sparks, Nevada, and he's retired. This kid of 7 years old that I knew is now in his late 50s. He was became a security, worked for the campus police at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, for his career, and then retired. His sister, Karen, is in that area. She's divorced, has children, and I think still suffers from what occurred in her past. Tom Leonard and his wife, after Rochelle, have both passed away. And it was her daughter, his stepdaughter, Gina, who was really the daughter to him, because once they were reunited with Tom and his children, it was so many years had gone by, and there was so much geography, and in those days there wasn't the kind of opportunities to travel as freely, and he didn't have a lot of money. So they saw each other, and he was more like an uncle than a father to them. And he never had the kind of role in their life that he wanted, and it really bothered him. Now this Gina, his stepdaughter, was the person who loved him and took care of him and was truly his daughter de facto. She was a wonderful daughter to him, and she still lives in the Buffalo area in Tonawanda. The other children, other than Tom and other than Michael and Karen, there was Stevie,
Sammy, and Patricia.
Patricia
was, he had a daughter with Rochelle named Patricia, who contacted me.
That was Patty's daughter.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
The only two that were Leonard's
Calabrese and
children.
Rochelle had a daughter named Patricia, who contacted me in later years and asked me to tell her about her father. And I told her basically, if your father says it's okay, I'll tell you what I know about your father. But she never came back to me and said my father was okay. He had two other boys, one named Stephen when he was living in the state of Washington, and the other one, strangely enough, named Sam, who he named after Sam Gimbroni, the guy who got him the relocation papers and was instrumental in him giving evidence against the mob. Patty had diabetes. His one leg was amputated, and he eventually died from the effects of diabetes probably 8 years ago. But Sal was talking about his bravado. He bragged about the fact that even though he was a convicted felon, he had a gun permit, and he kept his gun with him. I still have his business card on my desk. Patty, and it was, he would refuse to take the name the government gave him. He was always Pasquale Patty Calabrese on his business cards. He wouldn't, and you could look him up on the internet. I don't know, if they wanted to kill him, all they had to do was go on the internet and they would have found him. I visited him in Spokane and in Seattle as part of stories I was doing, and he was, as brash, come on, let's go to I went to that bar with him.
Well, the thing is that all of their lives have been affected adversely by that whole situation. And as a result of my involvement in the Leonard case, I had a string of 6 or 7 other people around the country, 8 actually, where I represented people who were similarly mistreated in one way or another by this program during its period of growing pains. As I said, I'm happy to report that those days are in the past, and we're in the past pretty quickly. But I am a critic of those early days because it was not policed and thought out as carefully as it should have been. It wasn't that people were venal in their thinking, or they just didn't care. It goes to show you how important it is to have oversight that is somewhat detached when you're going to be involved in things like this.
Yeah, I think one of the most rewarding stories I did is when Sal called me one day and said that Karen and Mike were going to meet their father, Tom Leonard, for the first time. Would you like to interview them? And I thought that was phenomenal, so I went out to Tom's house in the town of Tonawanda, and I interviewed them about their life of moving from here to there. And every time they moved, Michael would say, well, we moved and we changed our names. And I said, well, didn't that affect you having to change your names? And he said, I thought everybody changed their names when they moved. So that's the way they were raised. That was the life they led. And they moved from several places, from the Air Force Base in New England to Detroit to Reno and someplace else in between that I can't remember.
Just a footnote to all of that. I used the witness security program several times in the course of my career. By the time I used it, for instance, the Marshal Service, in honor of Judge Martoche, had become the place where if you had to serve process on anybody, you served it on the Marshal Service. So that was taken care of. And at the same time, the rules were changed so that there would be neutral site visits with children, I forget, once or twice a year, something like that. There were a whole host of changes made, but those were certainly two that Judge Martoche was instrumental in bringing about. So,
All right, got to conclude on this. Buffalo News, Tuesday, April 30th, 2019. After I was convinced by Lee Coppola that we could have this wonderful CLE today, which would be entitled The Fall of the Buffalo Mafia. And then we gathered together the Honorable Salvatore Martoche and Tony Bruce, star-studded panel. Buffalo News, April 30th, 2019. A Canadian murder, Buffalo's crime family. Is the Mafia still around? An article by Phil Fairbanks. Starting with you, Tony. Is it still around?
being away from it for three and a half years, it's difficult for me to give a really good answer. I don't think so. I don't know where this information is coming from, because when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, if there were any made members of the Mafia around, they were literally on life support at that point in time. So, and there wasn't any plans that I knew of to take on new members. So I don't think there's much there, if there's anything at all.
So, Lee, you wrote A Withered Arm in 1998, which sort of was the demise death knell pronouncement. What do you think?
Well, I have two initials for the Canadian mobsters' claims about a Buffalo mob, and they're BS. You know, I kind of am still, certainly not a reporter anymore, but still familiar with the actors and the late actors in the mob. And I simply say, where's the revenue? If there's no revenue, then there's no mob. And there's nothing of organized criminal activity that you would relate to the arm, the old Buffalo Mafia existing. Certainly there's crime, don't get me wrong, but it's also criminal enterprises that are either different ethnic groups or startup criminals, but nothing related to an organized criminal family that has a head and has lieutenants and has a consigliere and things of that nature, and soldiers. That just doesn't exist in Buffalo or throughout basically Magaddino's empire, except there is a criminal enterprise going on in Canada, because when Magaddino lost his grip of the Buffalo arm and the Buffalo family, the Canadians took over with fervor.
I think it's the Violi brothers, and I think there are certain organized crime figures through history, like John Gotti, who broke a sort of unwritten code which said you keep a low profile, and half the time we didn't know for a long time who the actual dons were, who the actual, there was a sort of a shadow group that was publicly identified, misidentified as the leadership for places like that. But I think it's akin in the business world to going from a company that employed a lot of people up and down the line to independent contractors. And you hire independent contractors, you do business with independent contractors on an as-needed basis. And I think that is ultimately the kind of organized crime. The fascination of the public with OC makes it a story over and over again. There was a guy, Peter Edwards, for the Toronto Star, who wrote, and still writes, stories regularly about organized crime and the connection, because people read that stuff. They like it, and they're fascinated by it.
Yeah, there was a mob guy who was killed outside his home, I think in Staten Island, about a month and a half ago. And I was wintering in Florida. I got a phone call from a local Buffalo radio station saying, can you go on tomorrow and talk about this? And I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? They said, well, you're an expert in the mob. So I got on the radio and I did some research. And I got on the radio the next morning and I said, if the guy's name wasn't Cala, it would be a drive-by shooting or a road rage shooting, because the mob doesn't eliminate enemies with somebody in a blue pickup truck acting alone. And basically, that's what it turned out to be, a neighborhood squabble. But the fascination with the fact that this guy who was considered a mobster was gunned down in front of his house, national headlines, big story. And wait a minute, blue pickup truck, a guy alone?
I think he told the kid to quit dating his daughter.
Yeah, something, yeah.
You know, it was a dispute over him not being able to date the guy's daughter or niece or something, and he was a little bit unhinged, and he committed this murder. And as Lee said, had it not been for the fascination with organized crime, this story would never have been a national story. It wouldn't have gone anywhere. But that's the world we live in. Take the cannoli, leave the gun.
Cannoli. Okay. With that kind of backdrop, the article on April 30th, 2019 ended with Magaddino, one of the longest tenured and most powerful mob leaders in the country, controlled a territory that extended beyond western New York into Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Ontario. The FBI says the Todaros took over from Magaddino at some point, an allegation Joseph Todaro Jr. has repeatedly denied. In fact, he went on to say, I'm not going to comment on organized crime questions, he said, but if you want a great recipe for cheese and pepperoni, I'll be glad to tell you. I can't thank you enough. This has just been one extraordinary continuing education program. And I'd be remiss, I guess, if I didn't at least ask all of you one final thing, and that is, what's the question you expected that we might ask that we haven't? What's that little gap saying, gee, Greg, you forgot to ask?
Maybe organized crime figures in the Jamestown, Chautauqua County area.
That's a good question. Maybe you can answer that. I think, Tony, you may have said that there may have been a made man in Jamestown.
The name escapes me, but back when I was on the job, there was somebody in the Jamestown area who supposedly was a made member of the Buffalo Mob.
And what did that really mean, made man?
Ooh, how much more time we got?
About 5 minutes.
What happens with someone who aspires to be a member of the mob, they become a thug, they run around, they do things for the mob. The mob decides that these guys are trustworthy, et cetera, and then I think Lee used the word make your bones. At some point in time, you become a proposed member of the mob. And then once you're a proposed member of the mob, you have to make your bones, which is you have to participate at some level in a homicide, which basically puts you in a situation where you're a murderer. So it'd be difficult for you to go to the police and start ratting out on other people. And then there's actually a ceremony, which actually was recorded, I think, by the state police or by the FBI in Boston, where they actually make you burn, and I'm going to have Lee describe it because I don't understand it. You prick your thumb, you put blood on a piece of toilet paper, you put the toilet paper in your hand, and you burn the toilet paper and you mumble some sort of oath, and at that point in time you're a made member of the mob, and you have to subscribe to this omerta or code of silence that goes in after that. Maybe you can explain that better than I can.
And you have to have a certain ethnicity.
Yeah, you have to be Sicilian, number one. And number two, the pricking of the blood is the continuity, the sanguinity of the blood from generations on makes you a member of that particular family. And as Judge Martoche said, the hallmarks of a mafia family are loyalty to the family and omerta. And those are the two things that I think have been distilled over the generations in the United States.
There have been instances of family members taking out other family members. It is a question of your first loyalty was to the mafia, to organized crime, and that replaced your family, your friends, your religion. This was the way it was. And who was your best friend yesterday might be the person that you're going to be asked to murder. And you better do it. And in those days, you better have done it, or you would face the consequences of not doing it. And that would mean you would join your pal in a grave somewhere covered by leaves on the edge of a swamp. But you know, I think that when people talk about the mob still being alive, they're talking about crime still functioning and business still functioning, but not in the sense of this regimented kind of structure that had existed. They're always going to do business. It's like the revival. You know, there was some earthquakes in Italy, and the Camorra had fallen on hard times in Campania, and the earthquake relief, the money and the clothes, the people who were in charge of that in these little hamlets in Italy happened to be in this part of the country. They happen to be the kinds of people who would privately, you know, take advantage of that. They did, and it was a revitalization for them. So they had the routes, for instance, for drug trafficking and everything. Those routes were still there, and they were used again, and they had sort of fallen on hard times, and they prospered again for a while until this Pizza Connection case, I think, really put a huge dent in them. Did it kill them? I don't think so, because in Italy, it's so much a part, and in Sicily, it's so much a part of the culture that I don't know that it's totally been put to bed. But I don't know the answer, but I would doubt it. What do you think?
I think it still exists. I think since 1992, after the two judges were killed, there was a public outrage, and I think that there's been forces aligned in Sicily to try to arrest and put the mafia away. But I don't think it will. It is so entrenched, I think it would be impossible to eliminate it completely. And just a side note, and very briefly, and I think Alan will probably get into this at lunch, you have to remember the mafia was created for good. It was created to protect Sicily from all the invaders that came into Sicily during the 13th and the 14th and the 15th centuries. And then it became something not so good. But it was created to protect the people of Sicily from the invaders because, you know, stuck out there in the Mediterranean, anybody with a rowboat and a rifle was able to invade Sicily.
If you want to consider patriotism, I hope you'll consider those Italian police and prosecutorial people who knew that the chances were overwhelming that they were going to be martyrs, that they were going to be assassinated, and who still understood that for the good of their country, they had to break this unbelievable relationship between the government and the mob, which had infiltrated almost every aspect of Italian politics. And to me, they are the biggest heroes I ever met. And when Louis Free and I and a couple others were members of the Italian-American Working Group on Organized Crime when I was Assistant Secretary at Treasury, and you wonder, Treasury, you say, how are they involved? The money. Always follow the money, and it'll get you to your goal. Because while criminals may put a good deal of distance between themselves and the crime, they put very little distance between themselves and the money. And I think that Tony Bruce will tell you that the money trail was something he followed regularly when he was doing his work. In any event, these martyrs, these people who died, are to me incredible heroes. And the people that I worked with on this organized crime task force in Italy, the Italians are almost all dead. And it's kind of a shock when you realize the people that you actually sat across the table with, not one of them is alive. They're dead, and they died because they cared enough about their country and about seeing it prosper that they were willing to take the chance, left their wives and children. Well, they're heroes.
Well, this is a continuing legal education for the books. This is unbelievable. So Tony Bruce, Lee Coppola, Judge Martoche, thank you, thank you, thank you.